Then, when a person arrives at this way of thinking, of living, really living this way, then we begin to understand what it means. Kirachim of al-banim. Kirachim of al-banim. It's not a metaphor. It's not, to quote Joe Biden, hyperbole. Anyway, he says this. It's not hyperbole. Right? It's not a metaphor. It's not hyperbole. It's the most literal of literal expressions. Kirachim of al-banim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu adores us like a father adores, and here's the key, not a grown-up child that would be beautiful enough, perhaps not even a teenager, a toddler, but the smallest of infants. Kirachim of al-banim. We, in all of our mistaken wanderings, in all of the trouble we think we bring to God and the world, and if only we could just get our act together, and with all of it, we cannot begin to imagine the shashua, the pleasure, as Rabbi Nachman says in Torah Yud Zayin, we cannot begin to imagine the pleasure that HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes in us just as we are, for who we are, for what we are. And we're almost conditioned to not believe this. It almost like insults us to hear this. It's very sad. We don't know how to feel love anymore. We just don't know. So I want to read you something that's going to help us remember. Okay, but this will end. There's a book that I discovered yesterday in the home where I was privileged enough to stay with my family for Shabbos. And it was one of those books that I had to stay up till 2:30 in the morning last night finishing. And it's called When Breath Becomes Air. I could not put this book down. The book is about a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, like the top of the top of the top of the top, who was in university for, I think, like 15 years or so, like something inordinate. Okay, he was in Harvard, he was in Yale, he was in Cambridge. Like the Ivy League of the Ivy League, brilliant Indian neurosurgeon, neuroscientist. And he specialized in obviously surgery, treating various kinds of brain injuries, primarily among them the C word, which we could also say cancer. A few months before he was about to actually finish his schooling, at 36 years old, he was diagnosed with the worst kind of brain tumor, the worst kind of cancer. And the book is him writing in the last few months of his life, describing his journey and the transition from doctor to patient. The journey from having a value, to knowing what it means to experience that. In the beginning of the treatment was appeared to be successful, but successful in that kind of way meant 10 years max. And so he and his wife decided, they had wanted to for a long time, they were holding off because of their schooling. She was a highfalutin, nurse, very, very prestigious, and he was, professor of neuroscience, neurology. They decided to bring a child into the world. Just after the birth, cancer came back with a vengeance. And he passed away the following year when his newborn daughter was 8 months old. So I want to read you, it's a selection of different parts of the book that he had put into one article. But it's all in the book, which I could not recommend highly enough. When Breath Becomes Air. Huh? The author is Paul. His name was Kalanithi, maybe? Something like this. When breath becomes air. You can look it up. And he published it as an article, I think on The Guardian. And the title of the article is Before I Die, Some Words for My Baby Daughter. Okay, again, this is some selections of the book as well as the bulk of the last chapter. And I want to read it to you with your permission. Brace yourselves. In residency, there's a saying, the days are long, but the years are short. In neurosurgical training, the day usually began a little before 6 a.m. and lasted until the operating was done, which depended in part on how quick you were in the operating room. A resident's surgical skill is judged by their technique and speed. You can't be sloppy, and you can't be slow. From your first wound closure onward, spend too much time being precise, and the scrub tech will announce, looks like we got a plastic surgeon on our hands. Or say, I get your strategy. By the time you finish sewing the top half of the wound, the bottom will have healed on its own. Half the work. Smart. A chief resident will advise a junior, learn to be fast now, you can learn to be good later. Everyone's eyes are always on the clock for the patient's sake. How long has the patient been under anesthesia? During long procedures, nerves can get damaged, muscles can break down, even causing kidney failure. For everyone else's sake, what time are we getting out of here tonight? There are two strategies to cutting the time short, like the tortoise and the hare. The hare moves as fast as possible, hands a blur, instruments clattering, falling to the floor. The skin splits open like a curtain. The skull flap is on the tray before the bone dust settles, but the opening might need to be expanded a centimeter here or there because it's not optimally placed. The tortoise proceeds deliberately with no wasted movements, measuring twice, cutting once. No step of the operation needs revisiting. Everything proceeds in an orderly fashion. If the hare makes too many minor missteps, and has to keep adjusting, the tortoise wins. If the tortoise spends too much time planning each step, the hare wins. The funny thing about time in the operating room, whether you frenetically race or steadily proceed, is that you have no sense of it passing. If boredom is, as Heidegger argued, the awareness of time passing, this is the opposite. The intense focus makes the arms of the clock seem arbitrarily placed. 2 hours can feel like a minute. Once the final stitch is placed and the wound is dressed, normal time suddenly restarts. You can almost hear an audible whoosh. Then you start wondering, how long till the patient wakes up? How long till the next case gets started? How many patients do I need to see before then? What time will I get home tonight? It's not until the last case finishes that you feel the length of the day, the drag in your step. Those last few administrative tasks before leaving the hospital, however far post-meridian you stood, feels like anvils. Could they wait till tomorrow? No. A sigh, and Earth continued to rotate back toward the sun. But the years did, as promised, flash by. 6 years passed in a flash. But then, heading into chief residency, I developed a classic constellation of symptoms. Weight loss, fevers, night sweats, unremitting back pain, cough, indicating a diagnosis quickly confirmed. Metastatic lung cancer. The gears of time ground down. While able to limp through the end of residency on treatment, I relapsed, and in the book this is all explained in excruciating detail, underwent chemo and endured a prolonged hospitalization. I emerged from the hospital weakened, with thin limbs and thinning hair. Now unable to work, I left home to convalescence. Getting up from a chair or lifting a glass of water took concentration and effort. If time dilates when one moves at high speeds, does it contract when one barely moves at all? It must. The day shortened considerably. A full day's activity might be a medical appointment or a visit from a friend. The rest of the time was rest. With little to distinguish one day from the next, time began to feel static. In English, we use the word time in different ways. The time is 2:45 versus I'm going through a tough time. Time began to feel less like the ticking clock and more like the state of being. Languor settled in. Focused on the operating room, the position of the clock's hands might seem arbitrary but never meaningless. Now the time of day meant nothing, the day of the week scarcely more so. It is a tired hare who now races. But even if I had the energy, I prefer a more tortoise-like approach. I plod, I ponder. Verb conjugation became muddled. Which was correct? I am a neurosurgeon. I was a neurosurgeon. I have been a neurosurgeon before and I will be again. Graham Greene felt life was lived in the first 20 years and the remainder was just reflection. What tense was I living in? Had I proceeded like a burned-out Greene character beyond the present tense and into the past perfect? The future tense seems vacant, and on others' lips, jarring. I recently celebrated my 15th college reunion. It seemed rude to respond to parting promises from old friends, we'll see you on the 25th, with probably not. Yet there is dynamism in our house. Our daughter was born days after I was released from the hospital. Week to week she blossoms. A first grasp, a first smile, a first laugh. Her pediatrician regularly records her growth on charts, tick marks of her progress over time. A brightened newness surrounds her. As she sits in my lap smiling, enthralled by my tuneless singing, an incandescence lights the room. Time for me is double-edged. Every day brings me further from the low of my last cancer relapse, but every day also brings me closer to the next cancer recurrence and eventually death. Perhaps later than I think, but certainly sooner than I desire. There are, I imagine, two responses to that realization. The most obvious might be an impulse to frantic activity, to live life to its fullest, to travel, to dine, to achieve a host of neglected ambitions. Part of the cruelty of cancer, though, is not only that it limits your time, it also limits your energy, vastly reducing the amount you can squeeze into a day. It is a tired hare who now races. But even if I had the energy, I prefer a more tortoise-like approach. I plod, I ponder. Some days I simply persist. Everyone succumbs to finitude. I suspect I'm not the only one who reaches this state. Most ambitions are either achieved or abandoned. Either way, they belong to the past. The future, instead of the ladder toward the goals of life, flattens out into a perpetual present. Money, status, all the vanities the preacher of Ecclesiastes, Kohelas, described, hold so little interest to chasing after wind. Hevel, indeed, Hevel Hevel. Listen to this, because here we end. And here we begin. And here we try to understand what it means, Kirachim of Albanim, what we mean to Hashem. Yet one person cannot be robbed of your future. My daughter, Cady. I hope I'll live long enough that she has some memory of me. He didn't. Words have a longevity I do not. I thought I would leave her a series of letters, but what would they really say? I don't know what this girl will be like when she's 15. I don't even know if she'll take to the nickname we've given her. There is perhaps only one thing to say to this infant who is all future, overlapping briefly with me, whose life, barring the improbable, is all but past. That message is simple. When you come to one of the many moments in life, he tells his daughter, when you must give an account of yourself, provide a ledger of what you have been and done and meant in the world. Do not, I pray, discount that you filled a dying man's days with a sated joy. A joy unknown to me in all my prior years. A joy that does not hunger for more and more, but rests, satisfied. In this time, right now, that is an enormous thing. Who knows what our accomplishments mean? Who knows when we're most valuable? At what stage? After having accomplished what exactly? When can we finally recognize that as we are precious to Hashem? As we are a blessing to the world. That little 8-month-old Cady didn't do anything for her dad. She couldn't have done anything. She wasn't even conscious of what she was doing. And he begs her in his final message, Mamish's final message, because he wrote those words days before he died. He begs her not to discount the great accomplishment that she accomplished just by being. Kirachim of Albanim. Hashem is out to give us. Ach toiva chesed yirtifuni. And he begs us to kol doididafik, begs us to let him in, which doesn't mean more intensity, but less. A life of Yishuv Adas that he wants to gift us. V'shavta ad Hashem lekacha. Shebezecha to aksiva v'chasima tova. Kut keben shiar, a year filled with Hashem's presence in the realest most intense and beautiful and calm of ways. Hashem.